I want to talk today about Plato's Republic and more particularly about justice, and then more generally at the end about some general features of his political philosophy. So I'm going to summarize some basics of the Republic at the beginning, and then I'm going to talk about the application of those basics of the Republic more generally to human political affairs. The Republic is a magisterial work and it constitutes Plato's uh, primary work on political philosophy. It outlines the specifics of an idealistic state, a utopian state, and it firmly establishes Plato as one of the most important political philosophers in the history of philosophy. The Republic starts inauspiciously enough with Socrates and some of his interlocutors, as usual, discussing the definition of something, and they're discussing in particular the definition of justice. There are several different interlocutors who we are introduced to in the first book of the Republic, including Cephalus, who represents the established opinions of Athenians, Polemarchus, who offers a little bit more sophisticated understanding of justice than Cephalus, and finally Thrasymachus, whose famous Thrasymacheian challenge constitutes the basis for the flight of fancy that Socrates undertakes in the rest of the Republic as he outlines the basics of his ideal city-state. Cephalus, for starters, is the first character in the first book, and he defines justice as honoring the gods, repaying one's debts, doing things that constitute fundamentals of piety. But Socrates pokes some holes into this, and Cephalus is quickly followed by Polemarchus, who thinks of justice as doing good to one's friends and harm to one's enemies. This is a little bit more sophisticated than Cephalus's definition of justice, but Socrates proceeds in the balance of Book 1 to poke some holes into Polemarchus's definition as well. Finally, Thrasymachus, who's the most important of Socrates' interlocutors in Book 1 of the Republic, enters and he offers a couple of different definitions of justice. And the one I want to focus on is the idea that, well, for starters, one is that might makes right. In other words, the most powerful are the ones who set the standard when it comes to justice. And the other is that injustice pays. Whatever one wants to do, if it is unjust, it constitutes something that one should do because it actually is more beneficial to one to do that. And Socrates, in response to the Thrasymacheian challenge, uh, he takes it very seriously. He enters into a flight of fancy in order to try to ascertain whether or not it pays to be just. At one point, for instance, in Book 2, when the Thrasymacheian challenge is restated by someone who is actually sympathetic to Socrates, but who wants to make sure that Socrates understands the gravity of the Thrasymacheian challenge. We find Socrates encountering the figure of Gyges and of Gyges' ring. This is basically like Gollum's ring. And in the famous Gyges ring story, Gyges finds this ring that makes him invisible, and he proceeds to sleep with the wife of the king and take over the king's kingdom. And the interlocutors, Glaucon and Adeimantus, uh, interact with Socrates in Book 2 and want to know whether or not Socrates can show that justice pays even if it doesn't produce good consequences. So presumably in the case of Gyges, the best consequences for him from a selfish point of view would have resulted from a course of action where he does the unjust thing, namely sleeps with the king's wife and takes over the kingdom. But the challenge that Socrates faces in the balance of the Republic is demonstrating that justice pays even if it is the case that the consequences of doing the just thing are not immediately redounding to one's own self-interest. And in response to this, Socrates says that in order to understand justice on a personal level, we need to understand justice writ large. And that means that we need to look at how justice proceeds in a city-state that is well ordered. And so what Socrates wants to do is draw an analogy, and in this analogy he wants to say that in order to identify what constitutes a just soul and whether it pays to be just, what we need to do is look at whether or not uh, it pays for a city-state to be just and what constitutes the just city-state. So just as he believes in a three-part theory of the soul, so also Socrates divides his city-state into three parts. At the top of the hierarchy in his city-state, there are guardians, and these are followed by auxiliaries, and these are followed by peasants or ordinary folk, the farming class, as it were. And Socrates is not especially interested in the ordinary folk. He associates them with the vegetative part of the soul, and thinks that they're going to live non-reflective, more or less manual labor based lives. He's somewhat more interested in the lives of the auxiliaries who he describes in his Republic, and he associates them with the courageous or spirited aspect of the soul. Much more interesting than either of those two lower classes, though, for Socrates, is the guardians, who are the premier class in the Republic and who make the decisions on behalf of the rest. Socrates' political philosophizing as Plato's mouthpiece in the Republic is very much centered on the guardian class, and he comes up with some radical and utopian kinds of proposals in order to highlight what he thinks is the ideally just state. So in describing the guardian class, it's important to remember that Socrates, as Plato's mouthpiece, is describing what Plato takes to be the ideally just political arrangement. There are several fascinating features of the way that Socrates says that the lives of the guardians need to be structured. For instance, the guardians' educational processes are very interesting. They need to be educated with a thorough knowledge of the forms, and that means mathematical knowledge. It also means knowledge of how to engage in dialectic, which is the last and premier form of knowledge that Socrates highlights. And that includes especially interacting with others and using more or less Socratic questions, which Socrates himself is engaging in the course of the Republic, in order to tease out from others the deep knowledge that is embedded within them, as Plato believes is the case in his recollective theory of knowledge. Also interesting is not just the education of the guardians, but the social structures and couplings of the guardians. So their sexual behavior is very closely regulated. They are only allowed to mate at certain times of the year. They're also only allowed uh, to basically birth the children, and then the children are ferried off to state nurseries where the parents are not allowed to form particular attachments to their individual children. This is an arrangement that Plato thinks is important so as to ensure that the allegiance of the guardians is just to the state, so as to ensure that there is not any kind of a divided allegiance among the guardian class, so that some have particular attachments to their own family members. Also interesting, as another social characteristic of the lives of the guardians, is that they are not allowed to own private property. Plato saw private property also as undermining the unity of the state, and he believed that the institution of private property is something that would lead to particular attachments over and against common allegiance to the state. The belief that this is mine and that is thine is something that will lead to people indulging in selfishness and also deciding to pursue their own interests over and against the interests of the state, which Plato believed to be paramount. Also interesting as another characteristic of the guardians, or of the social class of the guardians, is the fact that Plato thinks that the arts need to be carefully regulated. He is very afraid of the ability of arts of poetry and music to be able to speak to the soul in a way that rational argumentation cannot, and he wants to structure his state so as to ensure that the kinds of arts that are allowed in the ideal city-state are arts that are aimed at fostering nationalistic feelings. And so for this reason, any and all poetry or music that is not contributing directly to a nationalistic sentiment is something that Plato wants prohibited and banned from his city-state. There are several other interesting social characteristics about Plato's guardians that would be influential on later political philosophers. and that especially influence more utopian-style thinkers. But also interesting in the Republic is the very, I guess you could say, negative way in which the description of the city-state winds down as Socrates, as Plato's mouthpiece, describes the descent of the city-states into selfish indulgence and democracy, which Plato considered to be an inferior form of governance, and tyranny, which Plato considered to be the rulership of one for the sake of his own interests and not for the sake of the interests of the whole. And the fact that the Republic's description of a city-state ends on that kind of a negative note is something that suggests that Plato was very pessimistic about the possibility of humans realizing true justice, which for Plato is the right ordering of the city-state. And he believed that at least this negative ending to the Republic's description of his ideal city-state suggests that he was very negative about the possibility of true justice ever being achieved. Nevertheless, the Republic constitutes a very beautiful understanding of what justice is, and it is very central to the classical world's conception of justice. The idea that is central to the Republic, then, is that justice is the right ordering of the city-state. That's justice writ large. Justice writ small is the right ordering of the soul. Proper order, proper structure, proper symmetry, each thing doing its own, each social class doing its own thing, and each part of the soul doing its own thing. Guardians being rational and ruling, auxiliaries being courageous and spirited, the peasants being the element of growth in the society, and in the soul as well. A rational part doing what it does best, namely making decisions, a spirited part being courageous and emotionally involved, and then a vegetative part providing nourishment and nutrition. When these things happen, according to Plato, justice is achieved. The right ordering of the city-state and the right ordering of the soul are central to not only Plato's understanding of justice, but also the whole of classical Greece's understanding of justice. And it is by inspecting this very different understanding of justice than what we would today consider to be just, which usually is some version of each person getting what he or she deserves. In other words, if he or she deserves punishment like a criminal, then he or she should receive punishment. But if he or she deserves honors or awards or advancement, then he or she should receive those things. Okay, that's our contemporary definition of justice. More or less, it's the common definition, each getting what he or she deserves. It is interesting in contrasts to this contemporary definition to inspect the Platonic definition and the classical Greek definition of justice being the proper ordering of things, where each gets what he deserves, but only by means of the collective being ordered in the right way. And it is by inspecting a very different understanding of justice that was held in this classical Greek culture by a great Greek thinker that we come more thoroughly to understand our own conceptions of justice and what counts as just and unjust in our own day, and that we more thoroughly understand ourselves and how we can better our affairs and our interactions with each other in a manner that is more consonant with the true ideals of justice.